The key was at the bottom of everything. That detail matters, because my father organized his toolbox the way he organized everything else in his life, deliberately. With a logic that was entirely his own and immediately legible to anyone who had known him long enough to learn the system. Hammers by weight on the left. Screwdrivers sorted by head type and size. Measuring tapes coiled and stacked. Sandpaper folded and sorted by grit in the small side drawer. The man had been a farmer and a carpenter and a person who believed that the proper place for every tool was both a practical and a moral matter. So when I entered his toolbox for the first time after his funeral, sitting on the floor of the equipment shed on a grey February afternoon, working through it with the specific reverence of someone going through a dead person's most personal space, and found the key at the very bottom, beneath everything. Touching the bare metal of the box's floor, I understood that its placement was not accidental. You do not put something at the bottom of a toolbox organized like this by accident. You put it there because you intend it to be found last. Because you want whoever finds it to have already been through everything else before they arrive at the bottom. He had wanted me to be ready before I got there. I was 38 years old. I had known my father for 38 years. I had grown up on this farm, left it at 22, come back at intervals, watched him age, helped with the harvest 2 seasons running when his hip made the work difficult. Sat with him in his final 2 weeks when the cancer that had been quiet for too long finally made itself loudly known. I had thought I knew him completely. The key was 3 inches long, heavy for its size, rusted to the reddish brown of old iron left in damp conditions. On the bow end, someone had stamped 2 letters with a metal punch, EB. My father's initials were not EB. His name was Carl Whitmore. I sat on the equipment shed floor with that key in my palm and felt the beginning of something I could not yet name, the particular alertness that comes when you realize you are at the edge of a story you did not know existed. I was right. My name is Anna Whitmore. I grew up on the Whitmore farm in Granger County, Virginia, 212 acres of mixed cropland and timber that had been in my family since my great-grandfather purchased it in 1921 and broke the first field himself with a rented mule and a determination that my father described, without irony, as the defining family trait. The farm had passed through 3 generations before it reached Carl, and Carl had worked it with the same constancy his father and grandfather had applied, up before sunrise, out in whatever the season required, in at dusk with the work either done or deferred to the next day with a clear plan for its completion. I was Carl and Margaret Whitmore's only child. My mother, Margaret, died when I was 14, an aneurysm, swift and without warning, a Saturday morning in March that remains in my memory as a permanent before and after. Before March that year and after it. The farm before Margaret and the farm after, which was a different kind of place, quieter, organized around absence in the way that all spaces are reorganized around a central presence when it disappears. My father did not fall apart. I say that not as praise, exactly, but as observation. He did not have the architecture for falling apart, and he would not have considered it an option even if he had. He kept farming. He kept feeding me. He appeared at every school event with the punctuality of a man for whom appointments are a form of respect. And he sat through choir concerts and academic competitions and the basketball games where I warmed the bench more often than I played, with the focused attention of someone who is genuinely glad to be exactly where they are. He was not a man who talked about his feelings. He expressed them through presence and through work, which I had learned to read as the language it was rather than the silence it resembled. I left for college at 18, moved to Richmond at 22 with a graphic design degree and a job at a firm that did publication work for non-profits and regional publishers. I built a life there, small but good, an apartment I loved, work that engaged me, friendships that had accumulated into something solid over 16 years. I came back to the farm at holidays and occasionally in summer, and I called every Sunday. And Carl and I had the particular relationship of parents and adult children who genuinely like each other and have found the right distance to maintain that liking. He was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in October. He told me on the phone, on a Sunday, in the same tone he used to tell me about a bad week in the corn market. Matter of fact, informational, with the specific restraint of a man who believes that delivering news calmly is a service to the person receiving it. He died in January. I came back to the farm to close things out. Sell the equipment, manage the property, make the decisions about the land that needed to be made. I had taken extended leave from work. I had brought my laptop and my drawing tablet and the intention of making this as efficient as possible. Which is the intention of someone who has not yet fully registered that grief does not operate on schedules. I was 3 days into it when I opened the toolbox. 3 days in, with the initial administrative machinery of death partially complete, the calls made, the paperwork filed. The neighbors thanked for their casseroles, when I sat down on the equipment shed floor and went through my father's most personal object and found, at the very bottom, a key that was not his. The farm had 3 structures, the main house, the equipment shed, and the barn. The barn was at the north end of the property, approximately 400 feet from the house, at the edge of the field that bordered the timber ridge. I had grown up on this farm for 18 years and I had been coming back for 20 more, and in all of those years I had never seen the barn open. This is the kind of thing that happens in childhood. You accept the landscape as it is, without questioning the anomalies, because the anomalies are simply part of the environment you know. The barn was there. The barn was closed. The barn had always been closed. These facts coexisted with the barn's presence in my peripheral vision, registered and unexamined, the way you register the furniture in a room you've been in your whole life. I called my father's neighbor, a man named Hugh Sayers, who had farmed the adjacent land for 40 years and was the closest thing to a best friend that Carl Whitmore had in the last 2 decades of his life. Hugh was 74, still working his own farm in the diminished capacity of a man who has made concessions to age without fully surrendering to it. And he came over the afternoon I called because he said he had been meaning to come over anyway to check on how I was managing. We stood in the equipment shed drinking coffee from the thermos I had started keeping full as a survival mechanism against the Virginia February cold, and I showed him the key. Hugh looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at me with the expression of a man who is deciding something. "E.B.," he said finally. That would be Elias Brantley. The name meant nothing to me. Who was Elias Brantley? I asked. Hugh wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. He was the man who owned this farm before your great-grandfather. Before the Whitmore family. He built the original structures, the house foundation, the equipment shed, and the barn. He paused. He sealed the barn in 1959. Your great-grandfather respected it. Your grandfather respected it. Your father respected it. 3 generations of Whitmore men had farmed around a sealed barn without opening it. Why? I said. Hugh shook his head, not the shake of someone who doesn't know, the shake of someone who is choosing carefully how much to say. Carl never told me the full story. He said once that it wasn't his barn to open. That when the right person needed to open it, they would know. He looked at the key in my hand. He put that key in the toolbox for you, Anna. He never mentioned it to me, I said. No, Hugh said. I don't think he knew how to start that conversation. Carl was a man who showed things better than he said them. He finished his coffee. He left me with the key and the knowledge and the 400-foot distance between where I was standing and the north end of the property. I put on my coat. I walked north. The path to the barn was not a path anymore. It had been, once, you could see the ghost of it in the ground's topography, the slight compression of the earth that marks where feet have traveled consistently over years. But decades of disuse had let the grass grow even over it, and in February the dead grass and the frozen ground were uniform enough that the path was visible only to someone who knew to look. I knew to look because I had walked this farm my entire childhood. The barn was larger than I remembered from the outside. Memory compresses and distorts familiar things over time, and the barn I had carried in my head had been reduced by years of not examining it carefully to something average-sized and unremarkable. The actual structure was substantial, 40 feet wide and at least 60 feet deep, built from hand-hewn timber that I could see in the exposed framing at the gable ends, with board and batten siding that had weathered to a silver grey. The roof was metal, older metal, with the particular patina of something that had been good enough to outlast the decades without replacement. Someone had built this to last. I stood in front of it in the February cold with the key in my gloved hand and looked at the door. The door was not the standard barn door configuration, not the wide sliding doors of a working barn. It was a single entry door, set into the larger door face, with a single padlock on a hasp that was the same reddish-brown as the key. The lock had a keyhole rather than a combination mechanism, which placed its manufacture no later than the early part of the last century. I thought about what Hugh had said. 3 generations of Whitmore men, farming around a sealed barn. I thought about my father, sorting his toolbox with his particular organizational logic, placing a key at the very bottom of everything. I thought about what it costs a person to hold a thing for a lifetime without opening it, because they believe the opening belongs to someone else. What kind of faith is that? What kind of patience? I put the key in the lock. It required pressure. 65 years of weather had stiffened the mechanism enough that I needed to apply real force, rotating the key with both hands through the gloves. Feeling the internal components resist and then give in stages, each stage a decade of accumulated stillness releasing. The lock opened. I removed the hasp. I took hold of the door handle and I pulled. The smell came first. Always the smell, with old enclosed spaces, and this one was extraordinary. Not decay, not mold, not the wet rot smell of a building that has let water in. Something drier and older and more complex, aged wood and oil and metal, and something underneath all of it that I would need several more visits to identify. Which was leather and a specific mineral smell that I associated, eventually, with old automotive parts. I pushed the door fully open. The February light fell into the interior at a low angle, illuminating the near section of the floor and leaving the rest in a deep, rich shadow that made the barn seem to extend much further than its physical dimensions. I stepped inside. Let my eyes adjust. And then I saw what Elias Brantley had sealed inside in 1959. The barn held machines. Not farm equipment. I would have recognized farm equipment, would have been able to place it in the continuum of agricultural technology one had grown up watching. These were different. They were covered with canvas tarps, large ones, each object draped and shrouded like figures waiting for something. Arranged in 3 rows along the length of the barn floor with the deliberate spacing of someone who had thought carefully about access and airflow. I counted 14 of them before the shadows made counting unreliable. I went to the nearest one. Lifted the edge of the top. The smell intensified, the oil and metal and leather clarifying into something specific. A vehicle. I lifted the top further, pulling it back from the front end, and revealed a hood and fender in a deep burgundy color, chrome trim that had oxidized to a dull gray but was intact. A radiator grille of the kind that places manufacture in the late 1940s or early 1950s. A car. An old car, specifically, the kind that people who care about such things designate as vintage, as classic, as historically significant. I am a graphic designer, not a car person, and my knowledge of automotive history is elementary. But I knew enough to understand that what I was looking at was not a discarded farm vehicle. It was something that had been stored, not abandoned. The canvas tarps were heavy quality, not rotting. Someone had oiled the door hinges within the last decade. I could see the evidence at the hinge points, recent enough to still have color. My father had been maintaining this barn. Not opening it. Maintaining what was inside it from the outside, the roof, probably, whatever structural interventions kept a 65-year-old building weathertight. And the inside, the oiled hinges, which meant someone had been in here, not disturbing the contents but preserving them. I went methodically through the rows. 14 vehicles, each one covered, each one in various states of preservation ranging from what appeared to be original condition to what appeared to be partially disassembled restoration projects. I lifted tarps and replaced them, not touching the vehicles themselves, just looking, accumulating a picture. American cars, mostly. Late 1940s through late 1950s. The era before Elias Brantley sealed the barn. On the workbench along the east wall, a long, sturdy surface with tools hanging above it in the organized manner I now recognized as the habit of a careful man, I found the record. A composition notebook. Black cover, college-ruled, the kind used in schools. Inside, in precise handwriting that I did not yet recognize, was a log. Each entry dated, each entry describing work performed on one of the vehicles. Part numbers. Oil specifications. Notes on compression and carburation and electrical systems, written with the technical fluency of a professional mechanic. The log began in 1947 and ended, the last entry, the last page, mid-sentence as if the writer had been interrupted and expected to return, on March 14, 1959. At the back of the workbench, set separately from the tools with the specific placement of an object that is kept apart because it matters differently from the things around it, was an envelope. It was not sealed. The flap was folded inside, the way you leave an envelope when you expect someone to read what's inside and replace it and perhaps return. On the front, in the same precise handwriting as the log, to whoever holds the key. I sat down on the workbench stool and I read what Elias Brantley had written. The letter was long. 12 pages, written front and back on the same ruled paper as the log. He wrote the way he logged, precisely, without ornamentation, with the specific directness of someone who had been trained by technical work to say exactly what was meant and no more. He described the cars. He had collected them from 1947 onward. After returning from the war with mechanical skills that the army had developed and a specific understanding of what happened to quality things when they were no longer valued by the people who owned them. He had purchased most of them for small amounts from people who considered them outdated, had brought them to the barn, had spent 12 years learning each one's mechanical needs and addressing them. They were not a hobby. They were, Elias wrote, his understanding of something he had arrived at during the war. That the things made with real craft and real intention do not stop being worth care simply because the world moves on from them. And that someone must be willing to provide that care or the craft is lost, which is a specific kind of loss that the world does not always notice until it is too late. He wrote about his decision to seal the barn. He was leaving Granger County in 1959, a personal crisis he described only obliquely, with the reticence of someone who has decided that the full story is not the point. He could not take the cars. He could not sell them to people who would not understand their value. He had spent 2 years looking for someone he trusted with them, and he had not found that person in Granger County. What he had found was a buyer for his farm, a young man named William Whitmore, my great-grandfather, who Elias had spoken with at length over several evenings on the porch of this house and who had impressed him as honest and careful and someone who understood that land is held rather than owned. That a farmer's relationship to property is custodial rather than proprietary. He had told William about the barn. He had made a request, seal it and keep it sealed until someone comes who knows why. William had agreed. And 3 generations of Whitmore men had kept the agreement. I drove to the County Historical Society the following morning. Not the archive, the office, a 2-room space above the hardware store on Granger County's Main Street, staffed by a woman named Vera Hutchinson who was approximately 80 and had the specific, formidable knowledge of someone who has been paying attention to one place for a very long time. I told her I was Carl Whitmore's daughter and that I was looking for information about a man named Elias Brantley who had owned the Whitmore farm before 1959. Vera looked at me for a moment. Then she went to the back room and returned with a folder. I wondered, she said, setting the folder on the desk between us, if someone from the Whitmore family would ever come in and ask about this. The folder held newspaper clippings, a photograph, and 2 letters. The photograph was of a man in his 40s, standing in front of a car I recognized from the barn, the burgundy one, in what appeared to be the mid-1950s. He was not smiling for the camera but not avoiding it either, the expression of someone who has been photographed and is tolerating it. Strong hands visible at his sides. A quality of stillness that read, through the sepia tones of the print, as competence. Elias Brantley. The newspaper clippings were from 1959. Granger County Gazette, March and April of that year. The headline on the first, local mechanic Elias Brantley sought for questioning in connection with fraud allegations. I read it quickly. A business partner, a man who had financed a repair shop that Elias had operated alongside his farm work, had accused Elias of embezzling funds from the business. The allegations were, the article reported, under investigation by the county sheriff. The second article, from April, fraud charges against Brantley dismissed, complainant recants. The business partner had recanted fully, in writing, with a statement that the allegations had been entirely fabricated in the context of a business dispute that had become personal. The charges were dismissed. Elias Brantley was cleared completely. But Elias Brantley had already left Granger County by April. He had left in March, before the recantation, before the dismissal. While the allegations were still active, and he had sealed the barn and left the key with William Whitmore and driven out of Granger County in whatever vehicle he was keeping for himself. He had not come back. The letters in the folder were from him. Both addressed to the Granger County Historical Society, one dated 1971 and one dated 1989. He had been living in North Carolina, it emerged from the letters, working as a master mechanic for a restoration shop that had become, over the decades, one of the respected establishments in the region. The 1971 letter was brief. He wanted the society to know that the allegations against him had been false, that the legal record showed this, and that he had left Granger County with a clear conscience and had built a decent life elsewhere. He did not ask for anything. He did not mention the barn or the cars or the Whitmore farm. The 1989 letter was longer. He wrote that he was getting older and was thinking about the things he had left behind, not with regret, he was clear about this. Emphatic even, but with the recognition that some things needed to be accounted for before he was gone. He wrote about the barn. He wrote, I left 14 automobiles in the barn at the Whitmore place, sealed, because I could not take them and could not trust them to people who did not understand them. I made an arrangement with William Whitmore. I believe that arrangement has been kept. I have not attempted to verify it, because I made my peace with leaving those things behind the morning I locked the door. And I did not want to unsettle that peace by knowing too much about what had happened to them. But I want to say, for the record, that those cars are not lost property or abandoned goods. They were left in trust with a man I believed was honest and who I believe taught that honesty to whoever came after him. If anyone ever reads this, tell the Whitmores, I was grateful. And I believed in their keeping. He had died in 1994. Vera confirmed this through the records, a brief death notice in a North Carolina paper that had been sent to the Historical Society by someone, probably a colleague, who had thought to do it. Elias Brantley had died not knowing whether the barn had ever been opened. He had trusted the Whitmores completely and had never received confirmation of whether that trust was warranted. He had died with the faith intact and the verification unknown. I sat with this for a long time in Vera's two-room office while she quietly organized other things at her desk and gave me the space I needed. My father had known this story. He had known it or known the outline of it, the sealed barn, the key, the responsibility passed from father to son to son. He had received it as a trust from his father, who had received it from his father, who had made the original promise to a man who needed to believe that someone would keep it. And Carl Whitmore had kept it. Had maintained the barn quietly, had protected the contents without opening them, had placed the key at the bottom of his toolbox for me to find after he was gone. He had not known how to explain this to me while he was alive. He had not known how to begin the conversation that started with there is a barn on this property that has been sealed since 1959 and I have been keeping it for a man who trusted my grandfather. Without it sounding like the beginning of a story too large for an ordinary Sunday phone call. So he had done what he did best. He had showed me. He had put the key at the bottom. He had trusted me to go looking. Chapter 6, What the Barn Became. I am not a car person. I said that earlier and I want to restate it with the specific emphasis that comes from what happened next. Because the story of what I did with 14 vintage automobiles in a sealed barn is not the story of someone discovering a passion for automotive history. It is the story of someone understanding what they were holding and then finding the right people to help them hold it correctly. I called a man named David Reese, who operated a vintage automobile appraisal service out of Richmond and who came recommended by 3 separate people when I asked, carefully and specifically, for the name of someone who cared more about historical preservation than financial gain. David was 61, meticulous, and when I described the contents of the barn over the phone, the 14 vehicles, the maintenance log from 1947 to 1959. The letter from Elias Brantley, the silence that followed was long enough that I asked if he was still there. He said, "Ms. Whitmore, I have been doing this work for 30 years. I have never received a phone call like this." He came the following week. He spent 2 days in the barn. When he emerged at the end of the second day with his notes and his camera and the particular expression of someone who has been in the presence of something exceptional and is still processing it, he sat down at the kitchen table and gave me his assessment with the careful honesty I had been told to expect from him. The collection was, by his preliminary analysis, extraordinary. Not simply valuable, historically significant. Elias Brantley had not collected randomly. He had selected, over 12 years, vehicles that represented specific moments in American automotive manufacturing, models that were undervalued in their time and that subsequent history had recognized as significant. Some of them, David said, were possibly the only surviving examples of their specific configuration. The aggregate appraised value was not a number I will state with precision, but it was a number that made the decisions I was facing about the Whitmore farm materially different from the decisions I had arrived thinking I needed to make. I did not sell the cars. I want to be clear about this, because it would have been the most immediately obvious decision and it was not the one I made. I sat with the decision for 6 weeks, consulting with David and with a lawyer in Richmond and with Hugh Sayers, who said very little but whose listening had the quality of my father's listening. The kind that makes you hear yourself better. What I decided was this: the collection would be donated to a museum trust, with conditions. The conditions were specific. The collection was to be maintained as a unit, not dispersed, not sold individually, kept together as the collection Elias Brantley had assembled. It was to be named in full, the Elias Brantley Collection, Granger County, Virginia, assembled 1947 to 1959. And a portion of the donation's tax benefit, structured carefully with the lawyer's help, would fund the restoration of the Whitmore farm property, preserving it as agricultural land in perpetuity through a conservation easement. The farm would stay a farm. I would not sell the land. I had not known I had decided that until I heard myself say it in the lawyer's office. And then I knew it had been decided from the moment I walked back across the field after opening the barn for the first time and felt the specific weight of standing on ground that for generations of people had worked and kept. I went back to Richmond in April. Back to my apartment, my work, my life there, which I had been managing remotely, which my employer had accommodated with a generosity I would not forget. But I go back to the farm on a different schedule now. More often. For longer periods. The conservation easement required a management plan, and the management plan required someone to manage it, and Hugh Sayers, at 74, agreed to oversee the active farming in exchange for an arrangement that reduced his own operations land costs. It is working. The museum opening is in September. I have been invited to speak. I have written 3 drafts of what I want to say and deleted all 3 because they said too much about value and not enough about the thing that actually matters. Which is what it means when a person trusts another person with something important and the trust holds across time, across generations. Across the deaths of everyone who originally made the agreement. I have been trying to find the right words. I think they might be the same words Elias Brantley used in his 1989 letter to the Historical Society about the Whitmores and what he had left in their keeping. I believed in their keeping. For words. That is what this story is made of. My father's toolbox is in my apartment in Richmond now. I moved it there against the advice of everyone who pointed out that it would take up considerable space in a 1-bedroom apartment, which it does. And that it is heavy enough to have made the movers briefly reconsider their rate, which it did. It sits in the corner of my studio space where I work, the room where I do my design work, surrounded by the drawing tools and the screens and the materials of my professional life. I find it grounding in a way I cannot fully articulate. What I can articulate is this: my father kept a key at the bottom of a toolbox for, I don't know exactly how long. Long enough for the key to rust. Long enough to have thought many times about whether to open the barn himself and decided each time that the opening belonged to someone else. Long enough to have planned the finding of it, the placement of it beneath everything else, so that whoever opened the toolbox would arrive at the key last. Would have been through all of it before they reached the bottom. He taught me, without ever saying it, what keeping a trust actually requires. Not just the passive holding of a secret, but the active maintenance of what the trust contains, the oiled hinges, the preserved roof, the watchful attention to whether the barn was still standing. Still sealed, still waiting. Trust is not passive. It is a practice, like patience, like staying, like showing up. It requires daily decisions to continue it even when continuing is inconvenient or unexplained to the people around you. Carl Whitmore kept Elias Brantley's trust for 40 years without ever meeting the man. His father kept it for 20 years. His grandfather made the promise and kept it for the remaining years of his life. And now I am the keeper. Not of the barn, the museum has the barn's contents. But of the understanding. Of the knowledge that this is what people are capable of when they decide that something matters enough to maintain. I think about that when the work is hard or the days are discouraging or the distance between where I am and where I want to be feels unnavigable. I think about 14 cars under canvas tarps. About a key at the bottom of a toolbox. About a man who drove out of Granger County in 1959 with allegations against his name and a trust in his heart that he never confirmed but never abandoned. He believed. We kept the faith. Find the thing worth keeping. Keep it as if someone is counting on you to. They probably are.